Turn to Matthew chapter 6. We're going to continue our way through the Lord's Prayer. Matthew chapter 6, we're at verse 12 this week. Matthew 6:12. One of those verses that you can memorize without a whole lot of effort, because all it says is, "Forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors." A mouthful is revealed in that statement, or maybe it might be better said, a mouthful is revealed by what that statement does not say. And this is where I want you to kind of camp out. Jesus reminds us in this prayer that we need to ask God to forgive us our debts, not to overlook them. You ever thought about that? His use of the word forgive, not to ignore, not to overlook, not to bypass, not to excuse. But Jesus said, "Lord, forgive us of our debts." That word forgive. I want to, before we come to the Lord's Supper, I want to take a look at two things. One, what forgiveness isn't. I mean, when Jesus says to his hearers that when you pray you need to ask God to forgive, I want you to think about what he's saying to them that God doesn't do. And then I want you to think about what that one little word required in order to make it possible. So when Jesus prays to the Father and says, "Forgive us," he didn't say to God, "Lord, we've transgressed, we've sinned." That would have probably been a pretty profound statement, because today, people don't really think that they sin. They think maybe they make some bad choices, or they make some mistakes, or maybe they make a choice that you wouldn't make, but that doesn't necessarily make it wrong. Problem with asking people about forgiveness anymore is they don't think that there's anything they need to be forgiven for. But that point aside, we'll talk about that at another time. He says that when he comes to God, he says, "Lord, our transgressions, the things that we've done, would you please forgive them? Don't ignore them. Don't minimize them." Doesn't ask God, will you go? I'd like to hear this one from God. "Lord, don't say to me, 'Oh, it wasn't that bad.'" Because that's what we say to people when they come to you and they've wronged you or something. What do we usually say? "Oh, it's not that bad. It's not that big of a deal. That's not necessary," right? And somehow we think that is synonymous with forgiveness, and it's not. If God were to overlook our sin, if God were to excuse our sin, if God were to minimize our sin, then God could not be rightfully called fair or just. It could not be said of God that God does not show partiality. Because when you overlook, or when you excuse, or when you minimize, or when you said, "Oh, it's not that bad," all of a sudden you're looking at things and you're going, "Well, this one's worse than that one." When somebody says it's not that bad, it's always in comparison. It has to be. Wife says to her husband, "What do you think of my dress?" And he says, "Well, it doesn't look as good as it did on so-and-so." Wrong. Yeah, wrong answer. The husband's answer is supposed to be, "It looks marvelous, honey. Nobody could wear that outfit like you." Okay, I understand that. But it almost begs that question when you go, "It's not that bad." And you want to go, in comparison to what? If when we go to God and God were to say to us, "Well, your sin isn't that bad," we would want to know in comparison to what? And all of a sudden, God's now in the position of going, "Well, this versus that, this person versus that person." If God did that, He wouldn't be fair. He wouldn't be just. He wouldn't be unbiased. Matter of fact, it can be said that God plays favorites. You know? Well, Ken's sin's not that bad, but Red's sin is really bad. Well, why? Well, because you see, Ken's smaller than Red. So, you know, Ken's sin isn't as much as Red's sin, you know? In which case, both of them are safe compared to Jack, you know? All of a sudden now, God's got to kind of weigh all of this stuff out. Well, you know, God makes it pretty clear in the Scriptures that He's a fair and a just God. Remember that the next time you talk to somebody and they say, God and I have an understanding. We're just like this. We have an understanding. Well, if God is a fair and a just God, then He doesn't have one understanding with you and another with that person over there. God treats all people fairly. That's why when you look over in the book of Deuteronomy, He says this to Israel. Everyone who acts unjustly is an abomination to the Lord your God. He says whenever you guys have differing weights and differing measures, you run across that when you read the Old Testament, and you go, why does God care about, you know, whether or not 5 pounds is 5 pounds? Well, because if you're going to 5 pounds is 5 pounds with Ed, but 5 pounds is really 3 pounds with Joe, you know, that's being biased. That's being unfair in your dealing with people. And since He was expecting them to reflect His character, He says, you grieve my heart. When the people that are known by my name behave in an unjust, unfair, biased manner, they grieve my heart. That's the idea of abomination. You and I look at abomination and we go, well, there's this sin, this sin, this sin, this sin, this sin, and abomination is way up here. An abomination, or the word abomination, is an emotional word. It means you grieve me, you offend me whenever you behave in this manner, because it is so unlike my character to just kind of deal with people unjustly. I deal with people favorably and fairly. And 5 pounds is 5 pounds for every person that exists. The wage of sin is the same for every person that has ever existed. And if I were to say, well, you know, even for one person, it's not that bad. It could not be said of God that He is a fair and a just God. Now, there are things that Israel and the church is called to overlook. If you walk through the Bible, there's several places. You look at 1 Corinthians 13, you look at Romans 15, you look at Colossians 3, you look over in the book of Galatians. The Bible tells us to overlook one another's faults, to overlook one another's weaknesses. It says that we're to bear with one another in our struggles, that we're not supposed to keep a record of wrongs and then throw it up in their face. There are things that we're supposed to overlook. You know, when your brother's having a bad day and he calls you that name and you go, oh, I can't believe that he would sin against me in that way. We're not supposed to do that. We understand, we overlook that. They're having a bad day. And so when they come to us and say, will you forgive me? We say, but of course. But of course. We're not keeping a record of that wrong. We're choosing to bear with you in the midst of your struggle. And you know, that'd go a long way toward helping the relationships if we would bear with one another. But it seems like when it comes to our sin, we want people to overlook it. But when it comes to other people's sin, we want to keep a record of it. That's not being fair and just. And that's not being consistent with the character of God. Because God says, I don't overlook your sin. I don't excuse your sin. I don't, you know, kind of belittle it. I don't minimize it. I don't say to you that your sin is not that bad. Your sin's bad. All sin is bad. A sin of lying done by a 3-year-old is just as bad as it is by somebody who's 103. God's a fair and a just God. And He doesn't look at our sin and make them relative. Oh, it all depends. It all depends on what? sin is sin. And in the eyes of God, there are no shades of gray. Now, I understand and I want you to realize that the consequences of sin may have different impacts. If a 3-year-old lies to his mom about whether or not he took a cookie, is not the same as an elected official lying about whether or not he embezzled money. The consequences are greater. I understand that. But in the eyes of God, that child is a sinner, and so is that elected official. That both of them are just as guilty, even though the consequences may be different, because sin is sin. The wages of sin are the same, because God is a fair God. Now, somebody, if you were to bring this discussion up, somebody would inevitably bring up this statement out of the book of Romans chapter 9 verse 13. If you want to turn there, the reason I pointed out to you is that you might be aware if somebody brings this up. If you go to somebody and you say, you need to understand that God deals with all people the same, that God is a fair God. He doesn't make differences between people. He doesn't show favorability. Romans 9:13. Paul says this. He says, well, what about the statement that God made that Jacob have I loved, but Esau I have hated? It seems to me that in that situation, well, you know what? God's shown some favoritism there. Matter of fact, Paul goes on to say there in the verses that are following that, Paul goes on to raise that very issue. He says, what shall we say then? Is there no injustice with God? Is God playing favorites here? I mean, before either one of these people could do anything, before they were even, in a position to make a choice in life, it seems to me that God chose one of them. He played favorites. He chose Jacob and he rejected Esau. Matter of fact, verse 11. For though the twins were not yet born and had not done anything good or bad, so that God's purpose according to his choice would stand, not because of works, but because of him who calls, it was to her, he said, the older will serve the younger, just as it is written, Jacob I have loved, but Esau I have hated. You go, well, there's a case right there that God's playing favorites. But no. Listen to what Paul says. Shall we say then there is no injustice with God? May it never be. For he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. So then it does not depend on the man who wills or the man who runs, but on God who has what? Mercy. Mercy is the choice of an individual to not give what is deserved. That is what mercy is. Matter of fact, I would dare say that mercy would not exist were it not for the gravity of sin. There would be no need to. If we could relativize a transgression, if we could say, well, with one person it's really bad, with another person it's not so bad, if we could go through life and adjust the scales, level the playing field, so that everybody, kind of has this same outcome, there would be no need for mercy. Think about it this way. Ken had 2 daughters. And growing up, one of his daughters is very industrious and works very hard. She's doing her chores, she's going out and, doing extra things. And Ken had told both the girls, he had said, now you know what? I'll pay you for the job that you do. Every job you do, I'll give you $1. And both girls go, really? $1 for every job you do. So one girl goes out and, boy, she does 10 jobs. And Ken's going to peel out $10. The other girl does 1 job. Well, if Ken's a fair dad, Ken peels out $1 for her. But if Ken's one who says, well, I want to kind of be fair, and he gives the second one a $10 bill, is he being fair? No. Because he said that for every job you do, I'll give you $1. And one of them, acting on that basis, did that. And deserves $10. The other one, knowing the same thing, only did one. She only deserves $1. Now, it's full within Ken's right to look at the second daughter and to go, honey, I want you to understand something. You only deserve $1. But because I love you so much, I'm going to give you 10. Now, that's full within his measure. He could do that. But that's mercy. That's mercy. Pure mercy. And that's what God does. God looks down from heaven, and in his position, unstained, unmuted, uncompromised by sin, he knows the heart of every person. And he knows that every person deserves the same thing. And then he says, you know what? I also know the heart of so-and-so. And I'm going to extend to them mercy because they're going to respond to it, and that person's not. And God begins to enact mercy because justice is there. You cannot have mercy without justice. For the very nature of the two is that you are here and you need to be there, and something's got to bridge the gap. And that something is mercy. You remember the parable of the unforgiving servant that Jesus shared? Guy owed more money than he could possibly pay. Remember that parable? And the guy comes to the king and says, I know I owe it. The king doesn't say, oh, no, really you don't. Hey, listen, I thought about it. You know, what's $16 trillion between friends? It's not that big of a deal. And let him go. No, he said, you're right. You'll never get out of this hole. But because I have mercy on you, I will forgive you. That's the picture of God. When it comes to sin, all of us are in such a hole that mercy was essential. We would never get out of the hole were it not for the mercy of God. So when we talk about God's forgiveness, understand that God is not saying to you and me, oh, it's not that big of a deal. It is that big of a deal. Every sin is a big deal. Well, then why doesn't God punish so-and-so like so-and-so? That's God's call, and that's mercy. But every sin is a big deal. Why is sin a big deal? Because of the cost that made mercy possible. God didn't just decide to get up one morning and to say, you know what? I'm going to forgive sin. He didn't just decide and say, you know what? I really want to be reconciled to humanity, so I'm just going to forgive sin. I'm just going to wipe the debt clean. Because again, God would not have been fair if he'd have done that. For him to arbitrarily, go back on his word and say, I know I said that it was this, but now I'm making it this. We couldn't trust God. We couldn't rely on God. So something needed to make mercy possible. Something needed to be there in order to allow God. And to allow God to be able to exercise mercy, something had to be provided. Forgiveness didn't come free. And that something was Jesus. See, as you walk throughout the Old Testament, you become aware at every turn that sin has a price. Every time you transgress, you had to bring a sacrifice. Every time you did something wrong, you needed to come to the temple, the tabernacle, whatever it was at that time in Israel's history, and you had to make an offering because God was instilling in their mind that there's a price. That's the weight of sin. Something needs to cover that. Something needs to atone for that. And he's training them. He's helping them to understand that weight and that gravity of sin. And likewise to understand God's mercy when he says, I will accept that. Yeah, I'll take that. I'll receive that. My mercy extends to you because this offering has been made. He's training them and he's teaching them about the idea of the cost for forgiveness to be possible. Forgiveness does not happen in a vacuum. I would dare say, if you're a follower of Christ, you cannot extend forgiveness without there being a reason. Think about it. Your neighbor has, let's say 16 dogs. Well, they're good neighbors. They pick up after their dogs. They're faithfully, every Saturday they pick up after their dogs and throw the poop into your yard. Now, you're probably not happy with that. You're glad that your neighbor picks up the poop, but you're not real happy what he or she does with that poop. Now, you have a choice, right? You have a choice to hold this against them. Suppose you have three choices. Hold it against them, forgive them, or throw it back in their yard. Okay? If the neighbor is one that you do not get along with, is a thorn in your side, I can't imagine why. Are you going to forgive your neighbor? No, it's probably just going to make things worse. Can you forgive your neighbor? You could, but you're not inclined to because you know what? He ain't been real friendly to me. Why should I want to be real friendly to him? So you're probably not going to forgive him and throw it back in his yard. You're going to call the cops on him. You're going to file some sort of complaint. My neighbor's doing this, rather than forgive him, because you know what? He's just a crotchety old guy anyway. But let's say that the neighbor next door has Alzheimer's. Are you going to forgive him? Why? Yeah, well, gosh, there's a reason. They don't know what they're doing. As a follower of Christ, why would you even want to extend forgiveness? Why would the notion of forgiving somebody even enter your mind? Yeah, because Christ forgave me. So even there, your forgiveness didn't take place in a vacuum. You didn't just decide, you know what, I'm going to be a forgiving person. You thought, you know what, God forgave me. I have a reason to forgive. God had a reason to forgive. God had a reason to forgive because of the sacrifice of Jesus. Now I want you to hear this. I want you to hear this very clearly. The death of Jesus paid the penalty of sin. Okay? Wages of all sin is death. Separation from God, eternally. That's the price of sin. Book of Hebrews says that looking back into the Old Testament, we came to understand that nothing is cleansed without death, without blood. So we understand that it's a terrible thing that sin is, and we need a payment. And that final, ultimate payment was Jesus. When he went to the cross instead of you. You with me? So Jesus didn't die just for some anonymous issue of sin. Jesus died for your sin. You with me? So that when God says the wages of sin is death, and he wants to forgive you, where does he point? To Jesus, to the cross. And he says, I can forgive you because the price of sin has been paid. He doesn't just decide, oh, it's not that bad. Oh, well, yeah, we'll just overlook. No, it's been removed. The debt's been paid. So I can forgive you. Not only that, But the death of Jesus satisfies the wrath of God towards sin. Remember what I said when Israel would have unjust measures and God said this is an abomination? That it's unfair, it's wrong. God emotes with regard to sin. He has feelings. God hates sin. He hates sin because of what it does to people. He hates sin because of how it reflects upon Him. He hates sin because of what it does to His creation. God hates sin. That's why He judges sin. God opposes sin. That's why when Paul talks to the church in Ephesus and he says, you know, those people out there that are kind of lost in all of them, you were just like them, children of wrath. He's not talking about our wrath. He's talking about the fact that because we're hanging out with sin, God's wrath burns against us because of sin. Well, what removes the wrath? What satisfies God's anger towards sin? The cross, the blood of Jesus. So see, when we come to the Lord's Supper, we take two elements. We take bread and we take grape juice. We take grape juice. They took wine. It was wine. It was wine. You understand? It was wine. It wasn't cheap wine. It was good wine. It was wine. Don't get hung up on what it was. He took two elements and he said, one is my body, which paid the price for sin. That's what went to the cross. And the other is my blood, which is a new covenant, a new way to be related to God, since the animosity is removed. You have a new standing with God. It's not just that God says that the price of sin has been paid, but now that the barrier, the obstacle that separates us has been removed, now you and I can have a new relationship, a new way of communing, a new way of connecting. So we hold in our hands not just that the penalty of sin has been satisfied and God can forgive because He's a just God, but that now God looks differently on you. Now when He looks at you, who does He see? Jesus. Yeah. So it's like, that's my son. So see, when Jesus says to the people, pray this way, Lord, forgive us our debts, forgive us our transgressions, our trespasses, whichever translation that your Bible renders. When we come to you realizing that we're indebted because of our sin, we come to you and we ask you to forgive us, and God says, I will forgive you. It's costly that He's able to do that. It cost Him His Son. It cost Him Himself. It cost Him deeply. So deeply, and understand this, because it's been misapplied. So deeply did it cost God that He had to turn His face away from what His Son was going through. He didn't turn His face on Jesus because He couldn't look on sin. If God couldn't look on sin, He'd never look at us at all. You've been in that situation when your child's been hurt, or when you're about to see a terrible accident. What do? Look away. I can't stand to watch this. That's what God did. It broke His heart. It grieved Him deeply. He looked away as His Son bore all that was required for God to say 2 words, 3 words, or if you're Joe Biden, 6 words. I forgive you. I forgive you. When we come to the Lord's Supper, we come to celebrate the forgiveness that God gives. It's a very simple act. We hold a piece of bread, we drink a cup of grape juice. It's a very simple act, but it represents a very complex event. All that Jesus did, all that God did for you and I to hear those three words, I forgive you.